Kim Scheer is the tree and shrub breeder and manager of new plant development at Morton Arboretum in the suburbs of Western Chicago. Kim has the pleasure of working closely with regional and national nursery industry professionals, public garden colleagues, and academic researchers in the selection, development, evaluation, and introduction of new plants. As the manager of new plant development, Kim works directly with the Ornamental Growers Association of Northern Illinois and manages woody plant introductions for Chicagoland Grows, which is really one of the best functioning introduction programs that are really where public gardens are intimately involved. Kim also happens to be an alumna of NC State from the Department of Horticulture, where she earned her bachelor's degree in horticulture science and got her first taste of the diversity and potential of woody landscape plants at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. And I will say that she's one of the ones that got away. I think it was maybe my first class of interns that we offered Kim an internship, and she had already taken an internship with Tom Ranney up in the mountains, which, you know, being up in the mountains is not too bad a place to be. And while we missed out, I think overall we all benefited from that, because working with Tom with the plant breeding led her to where she is now. So without more than that, we're going to turn it over to Kim to talk about the elm tree improvement project.
Well, hello, everybody. I was hoping to be able to meet you all in person this year. I had big plans. Any excuse to get away to North Carolina and visit Raleigh again, I will take. So, but maybe next year, we'll see. I might have something else to talk about. And Mark is correct. I took Tom Ranney's breeding internship before I even had a chance to interview with Mark at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, but I did it anyway. And I kind of always, kind of looked back until I got this job, wishing I had worked at a public garden. But then I got a dream job where I get to do plant breeding and also work at a public garden, which is almost unheard of. There's not very many positions that are specifically focused on that. So I'm going to go ahead, and I think I can share my screen. Move all the little black boxes over here.
You should be good to go, Kim.
All right. Make sure I close out any other, like incriminating type things on my desktop. Okay. Are we good?
You're getting there. Yep, you're good.
Good? Okay, great. All right, so I wanted to talk to you about the legacy of elm improvement at the Morton Arboretum, because, as Mark mentioned, the Morton Arboretum is involved in one of the more successful plant introduction programs that involves public gardens. And one of the introductions, the breeding program that really got the Morton Arboretum off the ground with doing this was the elm improvement program. And so this is the Morton Arboretum. I don't know how many of you have been to the Morton Arboretum before. This is about the moment where I would say, hey, everybody raise your hand who's been to the Arboretum. I understand if many of you haven't, because it is kind of far, but this is 1,700 acres. It's a tree lab located just west of Chicago. So you can see, I think you can see my cursor down here. This is Interstate 88 running along our southern perimeter. And then this right here is the Arboretum on both sides of this State Highway 53. And we're surrounded by the suburbs that have kind of crept out from Chicago. This is a little, it's a bit over 20 miles west of Chicago. So you can see right here, zooming out a little bit further, here's the Lake Michigan. And then Chicago is right over here. And, you know, there's just this development that creeps out from Chicago. And we are this little green spot right there where that arrow is pointing. Just kind of tucked in all of that development. At last count, we have 9.5 million people in this Chicagoland region, which covers a number of counties. We at the Morton Arboretum are in DuPage County, and Chicago is in Cook County right over here. And it also seeps into kind of northwestern Indiana, where there's a town called East Chicago. So we're this nice little gem that's kind of tucked away in Chicagoland, and we're it's a kind of a rare kind of landscape out in this region with like rolling hills and forests with trails through them. We have 16 miles of trails. And as you can imagine, we need, you know, trees that will work in this environment. And so the Morton Arboretum, which was established in 1922, we have our mission, and the mission is to collect and study trees and shrubs from all over the world and to display them in our landscape in a beautiful way, and also to enhance the environment. And what's really important is to encourage the planting of trees for a greener, healthier, more beautiful world. And that all comes from the vision of Joy Morton. So Joy Morton, you may be familiar with this, the Morton Salt Company. That was his company that he established. And when he was kind of getting a little bit older, he decided he wanted to maybe establish something that would leave a lasting positive legacy. And so he, along with, he worked with Charles Sargent. So you may be familiar with Charles Sargent. He was the director of the Arnold Arboretum up at Harvard. And he consulted with him and worked with him to kind of develop a roadmap for an arboretum to be established outside of Chicago. What Joy wanted to do was to provide a space where people could come visit and enjoy, you know, these really beautiful, naturalistic kind of plantings on what was then, I think when he started his arboretum, was a little over 400 acres. And by the time he passed away, the arboretum had expanded to 735 acres. And so this is the aerial view of 1937. That's the earliest aerial view that we have of the arboretum. And you can see here is the Illinois 53 state highway that I showed you. And then back then, this was all agricultural land. There are plots of trees that Joy had planted because he also liked to experiment with forestry species. So he wanted to see what kinds of species would grow really rapidly in a forestry production system. So he had all these plots planted out all over his property, along with our collections that were started to establish the Arboretum. And that grew into the 1,700-acre tree lab that we have today. So going back to this aerial view, sorry, that was put in there. So going back to this aerial view, this is 1937. Back in 1937, we already knew that there was this disease that was wiping out elms or killing elms. And they were having this like slow, painful death, essentially. And, but in 1937, we didn't really think that it was going to come here to the Arboretum outside of Chicago. So a little bit background on Dutch elm disease. 1918 is when they first started finding in Rotterdam that there was this elm death. They didn't know what caused it. And then in 1919, the USDA actually established an elm nursery stock quarantine because they thought that, you know, if we received elms from, you know, Europe, then as nursery stock, then we would, you know, infect our own American elms or elm plantings. American elms were widely planted all over the country as street trees and in parks. And then in 1922, a graduate student, Maria Beatrice Schwartz, identified a new fungus. So she isolated this new fungus from some samples from elms. And then in 1927, another grad student confirmed what Schwartz found. And she also determined, her new finding was that she determined that this fungus could be viable in either live or dead wood. And then an entomology student eventually figured out that there was a vector, or elm leaf beetles were the vector for the fungus. And then here in the US, in 1931, Curtis May of the USDA detected Dutch elm disease actually infecting live trees for the first time in North America, and this was in Ohio. So the aerial view I showed you was 1937. We still didn't have Dutch elm disease here. In 1931, when Curtis May identified Dutch elm disease in Ohio, it was pretty isolated, so they thought that they had it completely under control and eradicated. And in 1933, that's when they discovered, the USDA did, that the Dutch elm disease wasn't just, you know, coming over here on nursery stock. It was actually coming over here on elm burl logs. So you're from North Carolina, you know, you walk out in the woods, you see burls on trees all the time. So we were importing these elm burl logs from Europe, you know, for woodworking. And so they found that it wasn't being imported on nursery stock, but it was in fact being imported in other ways. So this is 1933, pretend this is 1933. So this is, you know, an elm burl that they would have brought in. And this is Scolitis scolitis, which is the large European elm bark beetle. And that is like the primary vector in Europe. And this is the vascular streaking that those USDA inspectors found. So what they found was on the elm burl, they started identifying like little beetles coming out. And when they pulled that bark back, what they actually saw was this elm streaking, like what you see in this barley trees image. So they finally, you know, came up with the life cycle for Dutch elm disease, which includes not just a fungal life cycle, but also a beetle life cycle, so the vector. And so this figure has a lot in it, but there's a couple or a few major takeaways. First of all, there are two ways for the tree to get the disease. One is through feeding from an elm bark beetle that has spores on it. And then the other way is through root grafting. So if a tree is already infected and it's adjacent to another American elm, then those roots can grow together and they can graft, and then that disease can be transmitted through the roots pretty rapidly. So that's one big takeaway. Another big takeaway is that there's native elm bark beetles and there's also European elm bark beetles that are here, and they both transmit the disease, both native and non-native. And they can transmit the disease through, you know, live trees, but they can also transmit it through dead wood. So, you know, transporting firewood. What happens is these elm bark beetles like to lay their eggs in the bark, and then those, you know, eggs hatch and they're still firewood. So you can have live or dead trees with elm bark beetle in them that also carry the fungus. And the last thing is these smaller European elm bark beetles they and their larvae actually overwinter in any kind of elm. So it could be a live tree, it could be a log, it could just be some, you know, dead stems on a tree. It doesn't matter. The small European elm bark beetles will overwinter in either, both the larvae and the adults, whereas the native elm bark beetle will only overwinter in the healthy elms. So they'll go into the bark just to overwinter there. And today, these are two of the primary vectors in North America, the native elm bark beetle and the smaller European elm bark beetle. And so you can see on the scale bar, 3 millimeters or 0.12 inches, pretty tiny. So kind of rewinding back to the past, when they found Dutch elm disease in North America, there wasn't a lot of, you know, whole lot of proactive kind of, there wasn't a whole lot of action in Chicago to figure out ways to, you know, prevent the introduction of Dutch elm disease, or like in a lot of places. In Chicago, I found an old article in the archives where someone made a statement about how they didn't think these tiny little vectors could really travel this far anyway because of the prevailing winds if it's the Windy City, you know. So they figured that they were safe here in Chicago, in the Chicagoland region, and their elms would be okay. And we had elms planted everywhere. But they were wrong. So Dutch elm disease spreads westward. So, you know, this was big news. It was in the New York Times in 1971, a special report. 750,000 to 1 million American elms were planted in the Chicago region at the time. And in 1970, we had already lost more than 50,000 trees. And then we expected to lose another 50,000 in 1972, by 1972. So that's a lot of trees to lose from your canopy in a really developed landscape. And it's a lot of trees to have to remove from the landscape after they die. So it's an expensive kind of issue. So this is 1937, when they were completely ignorant about the possibilities of this little beetle and the disease it was carrying. And at the time, there was, okay, sorry. I guess I'll wait for the questions until the end. So in 1937, you know, we were completely ignorant of Dutch elm disease coming out here to Chicago. But in the early 20s, when the Morton Arboretum was first being established, we were receiving seeds and cuttings from the Arnold Arboretum in Boston or in Jamaica Plains. And back then, we received a packet of seed labeled as Ulmus crassifolia, which is a native North American species of elm, also known as the rock elm. So we received the seed, you know, our propagator, our first propagator, he propagated everything. And then they planted this tree right here that was growing in 1937 at the back of the Thornhill estate, which is where Joy Morton's family was. And it would actually become a really significant tree in the history of the Arboretum and the future of the Arboretum. Dr. George Ware, in 1968, he was hired to the Arboretum as the research director, the first research director. And when he got here, it was probably would be about 1971, 1972, when he finally noticed that elm that had been received in the early 20s growing at the back of the Thornhill estate. And George was a trained dendrologist, He had been a professor, so he was a consummate professor. He'd been a professor at a couple universities by this point. So this was later in his career that he was the research director, and he saw some, potential. He knew that Dutch elm disease had wiped out a lot of the American elms in the landscape, and he probably understood that it was going to continue to do so indefinitely. But when he was walking around the Morton Arboretum, he noticed this tree that resembled an American elm. So it had that beautiful arching canopy that creates those really nice avenues, green avenues. And it was healthy, so it didn't have any symptoms of Dutch elm disease. There were no yellowing leaves in the crown, no flagging, none of that. And it was this tree right here which went out with the announcement. So this was the tree that George saw, and this is the Thornhill Estate. And right here is Joy's study, the founder's room. So this is the tree that he saw, and this is it today, the Thornhill elm. So don't pay too much attention to that photo and this photo as far as the location of the tree and those windows. I think maybe the photo was scanned in reverse. So this is the Thornhill elm. And so George would use this elm to establish the Elm Improvement Program. So what he did was he propagated this elm, which was incorrectly identified. Come to find out, it was actually Ulmus davidiana, or David's elm, an Asian elm, which is a complex of what used to be multiple species. So George is right here, and he would use this tree to establish the first elm improvement program at the Arboretum. And he also started to speculate, well, if this tree is resistant to Dutch elm disease or not susceptible, maybe there's potential to develop other elms that aren't susceptible. And maybe there's other genetic material out there that's also not susceptible. So he already knew how to establish a breeding program. And he introduced this one. So we introduced this as Accolade elm, or Ulmus Morton is the cultivar. And he selected it because of its resemblance to the architecture of the American elm, and also because of its disease and pest tolerance. And it's just as adapted to these tough urban conditions that we have, where we have really high pH, drought, flooding, no soil. And we also here in the Chicago region have, desiccating winds in the winter and polar vortexes. So if it can grow in Chicagoland, it can probably grow where you are. It gets hot and humid here too. So George was really kind of focused on creating a greener, healthier, more beautiful world, and addressing our mission through the actions of his elm improvement program. And so he used that elm to continue kind of developing some new objectives. And he started writing articles in the early 80s, tough trees for tough places. So first he set out by defining what is that? So what do urban trees have to tolerate? Well, they have to tolerate extreme temperatures. It gets really, really, really hot from the urban heat island effect, from all the radiant heat. It also gets incredibly cold up here in the upper Midwest. And then, like I said, drought and flood, we have high winds, we have blizzards. And George described the soils here as hostile, or in urban environments as hostile, because of those pH issues and really the lack of soil in an urban environment. This is in Portland, Oregon. So, they've got trees growing in cages there. I think that's actually maybe like a dog run for some poor sad dog in the city. So he wrote this in Little Known Asian Elms, Urban Tree Possibilities, and then also In Search of New Kinds of Elms. And these were all published by the Journal of Arboriculture. So he started publishing these articles and started really kind of investigating what it meant to be an urban tree. And then he also started focusing on expanding the genetic diversity that he had available to him to use in an elm improvement program. He already knows that the Accolade elm is resistant or not susceptible, but he wanted to really expand that genetic diversity, because anytime you have a breeding program, you want to have as much genetic resources as you can to find all the traits that you're interested in. And so he took this group out to China. I think this is actually the other with the 1A Jiangxi province, not the 2As, back in 1990. And they went out there to go hunt for elm seed, wild collected elm seed. And they brought all that back. And then he also would receive seed from, other researchers in China. So other researchers would send him letters and, say things like, I know you love elms like life. Last month I visited the University of Nebraska and I read your paper, Little Known Elms from China, Landscape Tree Possibilities. So that one article. And I'm very proud of your success in scientific experiments, your integrity, and how you devote yourself to the cause. So this forestry researcher in China was actually really excited to help George collect seed to send them back to George in the US for a germplasm resource. And so he started collecting seeds both himself through collection expeditions, but also through collaborators. And he started proposing some replacement elms for the American elm. And here's a few of those. So Ulmus macrocarpa. He chose this one because it had a broad geographic distribution. So he's thinking it was broadly adapted, and you can also look at those, countries where it's distributed: Mongolia and Siberia, northern China, Korea, really cold areas, some really desolate arid landscapes as well. Strong wood. It was also had a variation in form, being both a shrub to medium-sized tree, and it was adapted to humid and arid regions. And he proposed it would tolerate our hostile conditions. And currently, there are no known selections of this species in the U.S. trade. So I used the book, the new tree book that was published by Durr and Warren, to find out. You can actually go in there and get information for different species and how available they are in the nursery trade today. And then there's Ulmus glaucescens, which is a native to Gansu province, which is dry in China. It's also a small tree. So we like smaller trees for urban environments because they have to fit in smaller landscapes. We also like them for areas where, you have your utility lines. So we want shorter trees so that they don't grow up into the utility lines. It had a finer texture, so he wanted to add a different element of texture into the foliage. And it had a broader range of fall color. Usually you think of elms as having a kind of dingy yellow fall color. And of course, it's tolerant to these urban conditions. This also has no known selections yet in the US trade. And then Ulmus davidiana. So this is where Accolade elm comes from, and where all the Asian elms, a lot of the Asian elms you see in the trade today come from, is this species complex of Japonica, what used to be Japonica, propinqua, and wilsoniana. So these have a pretty broad geographic distribution again. They have a wide variation in habit. And of course, they're tolerant to these hostile soils. And this particular species complex has 13 selections that are listed in the tree book, published in 2019. And there is, so in 1980, I have this note down here, there was only the one chance seedling selection, Sapporo Autumn Gold, that was available. The photo that you see right here in the upper right-hand corner is an Accolade elm. And then there is Ulmus laciniana, which is a really cool elm. It's got this fall color, but then it also has these interesting lobes at the apex of the leaf, which is not really what you think of when you think of an elm leaf. Also a small to medium tree, drought hardy, maybe, and the branching is like a zelkova. So you have this base branching right here. And these photos are from the trees in our elm collection at the Arboretum. And this too, we have no known selections in the US trade. And then I think this is the last one, the lacebark elm. So this one you're very familiar with in Raleigh. They're planted as street trees in downtown Raleigh. So that's where I like to get photos of it. And, you know, George thought when he was writing new elms for the urban landscape that this would be a great tree for the urban landscape, but more in the South, less so, you know, up here in the upper Midwest, because it's not really as cold hardy and we have these polar vortex events. But it's also great because it has these fantastic glossy leaves, and we really love that attractive lace bark. I know there are other issues with it, which I will definitely talk about later. So George created kind of this list of potential elms that could replace the American elm in the landscape. And then he collected all this material, and then he developed these selection criteria. So he's planting out seedlings, wild collected seedlings. He's conducting crosses, doing controlled hybridization between elms. And he's growing all this in his research field at the Arboretum. And then he's going through and he's selecting for disease tolerance, pest resistance. He doesn't want, you know, trees that have their leaves that are being chewed on by like leaf miners or the elm leaf beetles. He also was looking at cold hardiness, of course, vigor. So you want something vigorous because you want something to grow pretty rapidly in a nursery production system. Not too rapidly, you know, it's got to be just right, because you don't want it to have to prune it too much. So he's searching for vigorous trees that would grow quickly in the landscape. And then he was also looking at this red foliage that he has in this photo. So he was germinating seedlings of Asian elms, and he started noticing that there were a lot with emerging red foliage. And what he thought when he started selecting these for his breeding population was that if he increased the pigment concentration in the foliage enough, that he would be able to select a tree that in the fall, when the chlorophyll breaks down, would have enough red pigment to actually produce red fall color instead of yellow fall color. So that was one of his like really big kind of objectives that he was working towards. And one of the hybrids that came out of all this effort was a Triumph elm. So that's Morton glossy is the cultivar name. And this was a hybrid between Accolade, and then Vanguard is another of our Chicagoland Grows introductions. So this is a nice large tree growing up to 60 feet tall and 40 feet wide. And nurseries really love this as a production tree because it grows fast, but they don't really have to prune it that much. So it's very low maintenance. And then it also has this, you know, disease and pest resistance. And then we also have commendation. So this is, these photos are taken at Chicago Botanic Garden, which is just north of Chicago. This includes Russian genetics. So it includes there was, you know, this is a more complex hybrid. There are a few crosses involved in this. And the Russian genetics that George used was to kind of improve that adaptability to really hostile soils and also that really cold climate. This is zone 4 hardy, so North Dakota hardy, which is a really big deal. And then it gets this golden fall color. And so today, you know, one of those lasting legacies I think of George is there was only that one cultivar of Sapporo Autumn Gold available. It was a chance seedling back in 1980 when George was first starting all of this. And today, you know, in 2017, 2018, we sold 97,000 liners, about that, of just Morton Asian elm introductions. So they're widely planted now. This is a photo of Accolade elm. This is actually in Boston, Massachusetts. So I like to think of this as like a full circle for the Accolade elm. It started as a seed collected in Jamaica Plains outside of Boston and made its way over to Chicago and eventually rerouted itself back clonally to Boston to be planted in this landscape that was never native because it's an entirely built landscape there in that city. The tree is also, these trees are also produced via micropropagation and grafting. And there's more than 13 cultivars now, which is fantastic. So today at the Arboretum, our breeding program continues. So George had those first few introductions that he got to send over to J. Frank Schmidt Nursery out in Oregon to Keith Warren for evaluation and introduction. And then he took all this stuff that he was selecting in his field that wasn't introduced, and he built a breeding population with it. So he selected it for all those traits that I listed, and he planted them in a really, really safe space. And at this point in the talk, I would say, does anybody have any idea what safe space that might be? Where would you plant trees where you wouldn't want them to be cut down because of a road or a house being built? But we're on Zoom. So he planted them at a cemetery. So he had his assistant at the time, and Chris Bachtel, who was the propagator at the time, they grafted a bunch of his selections and they made a few clones of everything, so everything was replicated. And then they had all these species represented, and they planted them right here in this cemetery in an isolated block, basically. So it's just like off in a little suburb right near the Arboretum. And we can go there whenever we want to go see George's trees. And so now what I do, carrying on his legacy, is all I have to do is go to his breeding population that he created. Elms are wind pollinated. So I just have to wait for them to start flowering, and then I just have to watch and make sure they set seed. And then I go out there and I collect seed. So in the fall of 2018, this is one of my first seedlings shutting down. So that spring, I went and collected 3,000 seed, maybe a little bit more than that, but I sowed 3,000 seed from 3 different females. And in the fall in my greenhouse, they started doing this, which initially you might think, oh, these are greenhouse conditions. So it's not exactly, you know, a natural environment or the environment these trees will be planted in, which is, you know, true. But then all of them started shutting down, and you can see that there's all the different fall colors, and you can see there's even that, you know, dingy yellow fall color that elms are more well known for. So I thought, okay, maybe I got something. So I started selecting seedlings based on that. And then in 2019, I had to select and transplant the 2018 seedlings. So with the help of my interns and a couple of volunteers, we, from the 3,000, selected 300 seedlings, and we planted those out in this hoop house. And this is Joe. He was my intern for 6 months. And then he's cleaning these up at the end of the summer. You can see they grow pretty rapidly. So we selected for the red pigment and the fall seedlings, the fall color, but then we also selected for new flush red pigments. Any red pigment on new growth in June of 2019, when we were potting these up, we went ahead and selected those too, even if they didn't have red fall color. And we selected for dwarf reduced internodes and we selected for vigor. And so that's what we have here in the 300. So then we left in like, I think it was early October, and we went and had fun at IPPS, Eastern Regions Conference in Wisconsin, where we were doing professional development, we're not just having fun. So we saw Accolade elm planted up in Wisconsin at the Berner Botanical Garden. And then we also, went to a McKay nursery, a wholesale nursery, where they had our elms and root bag production, so containerized elms. And then we came back to the hoop house, and fall color had set in, and we saw this when we walked into the hoop house, which was really amazing, because that's not what I saw in my greenhouse. I mean, what I saw in my greenhouse is pretty cool, but this was this definitely made us, our mouths dropped. And so just, some eye candy. You can see there's like red with hints of orange and yellow. And then there's these where it's like more yellow orange with like red, and the venation is really cool. This has like a weird twist to the leaf. So this is like a big breeding population with multiple species and all kinds of genetics. So we have no idea what we're going to come out with because we don't know who dad is. And then we have these kind of red fall color, and some more of this kind of wine. And that's not an elm, I'm sorry. That's my dog Maybell, who also was an NC State grad because she was there with me when I was an undergrad. So anyways, she helps out in the nursery sometimes. So 2019, that was 2019. I was supposed to sow thousands of more seeds also, but we'll get to that. So in 2020, that's this year, field plant 2018 seedlings. So, breeders were big on timelines. And then we're gonna begin our fall color evaluations in the field this year. So this is my new assistant, Andrew. I just hired this year. With our 61 elms selected out of 300 based on fall color. So we took everything out of that hoop house that had that fall color. It turned out we had 61 of them. And it wasn't just the ones that had red fall color in the greenhouse. There was other stuff in there that had really cool fall color. So I'm really glad I didn't throw everything away that first year. So I was supposed to sow thousands of more seeds in 2019. I didn't. This was a learning experience for me living in Zone 5, Chicago. What happens here is, we do get like a little bit of a warm spell, warm enough for winter flowering trees to bloom, and then, or early spring flowering trees to bloom. And so everything starts flowering, and then we get snow, or like a really terrible freeze, which happened again this year. And anything that's been fertilized at that point aborts. Anything that's just open dies. There's no more flowers. So you don't get any seeds. So I got no seeds last year. So this year I had to sow thousands of more seeds. And so we sowed a little bit more than 4,000 seeds this past week, I think. It's all blurring together now, maybe 2 weeks ago. These are in containers in my greenhouse. So hopefully in there, this is all from one female parent that I ended up going with. And hopefully she gives me more red fall color seedlings. And then in 2023, we'll start inoculating our elms that are in the nursery, in the tree breeding nursery out in the field, with virulent strains of Dutch elm disease. And then we'll repeat that whole cycle for every year of selections that we make. Hopefully by 2044, we will have completed our propagation, production, and performance trials and have a selection actually in the pipeline, with a name or something. So that's about 20 to 25 years from seed. Trees take a really long time. George actually didn't even see his elm population mature and start crossing and producing seeds. So this is really exciting for me. Okay, back to lacebark elm. So you're all familiar with lacebark elm, and Ware did note that it was not reliably hardy in these northern states. However, we do have a few at the Arboretum that have made it through multiple polar vortexes, and so there is potential for maybe having something that's a little more cold hardy. And if you site it correctly here, then we could probably grow more lacebark elms in our landscape. We just can't grow them in a field production nursery. So the big issue with lacebark elms is not so much their broad adaptability. I mean, look, this is July 15, 2019 in New York City. It was incredibly hot and humid there when I was there. I stepped outside, I took a few steps, and my pants were completely soaked, not just from sweat, but from humidity. And then the same, month, I go to Vegas, not for vacation, it was for work. There was a conference there, and it was hot and dry, and I was there during the hottest part of the year. It was more than 100 degrees there when we were there, and we saw these lacebark elms actually growing on the strip. I don't know how they'll do, but we'll go back and visit in a few more years and see how they're doing. So it's pretty broadly adaptable, but it's really weedy, right? So I know it's like a huge weed problem in the Southeast, in the Mid-Atlantic, and the Northeast. So what we'll be doing with the lacebark elm at the Morton Arboretum is actually working towards developing a triploid cultivar, or something that has 3 sets of chromosomes that has highly significantly reduced fertility. And so hopefully we can get that, and that's something that we've started the process on. So I don't know, maybe like another 25 to 35 years. Maybe we'll see something, a lacebark elm that doesn't produce a bunch of weedy seed. And then I have to mention the American elm. This is an American elm that's actually growing outside of my building. So I live in Oak Park, Illinois, which some people might be familiar with. It's this beautiful village outside of Chicago, in the suburbs of outside of West Chicago. And our canopy is actually an arboretum. So we have an accredited arboretum here. It's very diverse. And we still have these American elms, which you will see here and there. And these are actually treated here with fungicide injections. And I don't know if you can see it in this photo, but right here where my cursor is pointing is a hole. And then there's another one like right here. And these are at the base of the tree. So these trees that are special to the village, that are high value trees that haven't succumbed to disease already, have been treated with either Arbortect or Alamo. It's not a curative treatment, it's just a preventative treatment. So if you have a tree that's not really diseased, then you can start treating it if it's a really special tree. Or, if you have a tree that's already got the disease and is already showing symptoms, you're probably not really going to want to treat that. So this is something that we have here, kind of like happening in a few villages in the area who are maintaining their American elms. But we also have this other legacy at the Arboretum, and that is Gene Heimlich and the American elm. And he was a plant pathologist for the Illinois Natural History Survey. And he actually watched the devastation of DED unfold. And so down in Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois area, in the 80s, he started collecting seed from all the remaining trees. And his assumption was that, maybe not all of these trees are resistant. Some of them got skipped by DED. But maybe one of them has like some sort of tolerance, some mutation, DED. So he collected all these seed, grew seedlings, and in the 90s, he brought these trees to the Arboretum. And we planted them here near George's research field. in the 90s, and George was still here at the time. And then fast forward to the 2000s, Stephanie Adams comes along, and she's been trained in arboriculture at Bartlett Tree Lab. She's also a trained plant pathologist. She's currently our plant healthcare leader. We're very excited to have her back. And she has a passion for breeding elms. So she did a number of inoculations on these Heimlich trees of very virulent strains of DED. And then she selected her best 5 and started doing crosses between those. He started using those as parents. And so today, what we're working on is we have all these trees that she's developed, and she's had them all inoculated to confirm that they have some sort of tolerance to DED, and they're all planted out at our nursery right now. So what we hope to do is distribute those trees to our regional municipalities and have them planted out in the landscape. And then we can observe them in those urban suburban landscapes or the traits that we're interested in. And hopefully we'll get a selection out of those American elms that Stephanie's been working on for the past, I don't know, 10 years or so. So that may come along a little bit sooner than a sterile lacebark elm or even a red fall color elm. And if you're really interested, I have these 2 books to recommend. Republic of Shade, it's all about the American elm. It's very well written narrative, format. And then Urban Forest, if you haven't already seen that book or read it yet, is also really a great book about not just elms, but different urban trees and their legends and the people who've kind of affected and impacted that urban landscape. And with that, that's the end of my talk. And I always say, let's build some happy little trees. This is a little bit of artwork from a nursery friend of mine. So thank you so much for your attention. Let's see. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Kim. That was great.
Oh, thank you.
We didn't have a lot of questions in the chat, but someone did ask, and I think it was a fun question. They were talking about the 2 different bark beetles being in different genera. And she was wondering, how can they have similar life cycles and similar taste in trees, and how are they different enough that they're in different genera, but do similar things?
I'm not an entomologist, so.
Which was, by the way, my answer. But I did want to add that evolution often leads down to similar paths, and things that are unrelated can often be very similar to each other, like the viceroy amount of butterflies, for instance.
I had
I'm
a
not saying
question.
they're a mimic or anything like that, but could just be one of those flukes. And
Yeah.
it could be 2 different genera that are fairly closely related too.
Yeah.
I think Betsy might be typing a question.
Well, I had a question while we're waiting. Kim,
Yeah.
did you say you had Ulmus laciniata growing at Morton?
It's growing in the, we do have it growing at the Morton, and then it's growing in the Naperville Cemetery.
Okay.
I let that one out.
Yeah.
I let out my location. No.
That's okay. We won't rush over there. I was just curious because I've seen that growing really well in Shanghai, where it's almost subtropical.
Oh, it really?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty, so very broadly adaptable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I guess, yeah, lacebark elm is grown down in Louisiana too. I saw it down there. So yeah, some very good broad adaptability in elms, I think.
Yeah.
Which, we need in the Chicago region. I know you all need it too, but up here, it's just with our climate change forecast, not only are we going to keep getting warmer, but we are also going to have these ridiculous polar vortex events, so we have these 2 polar opposite kind of climates that we have to deal with every year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have someone in the chat, Betsy, who's
Okay.
volunteering some space for North Carolina trial plots.
I'm sure I will need to test in North Carolina. I do like North Carolina for the heat and humidity testing.
There you go.
Yeah.
And someone who has mentioned that they spent a summer in the 50s burning diseased logs at the Morton Arboretum. Did you
Oh,
see that?
wow.
Yeah. Oh, that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing there's a few people who've been to the Arboretum that are in Raleigh.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I think there's a feature somewhere that we could raise a hand, but maybe that's
It's in reactions.
webinars that can do that. But
No, it's in reactions at the bottom. You can do
oh,
a
there you go.
thumbs up
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
if you've been there. So, Kim, what other things are you working on?
Oh, so many things. So
What are
the
you
elm is-
excited about? What are you excited about?
What am
that
I
you're working on?
excited about? So, well, I have some hazelnuts that are really cool. So there was a breeder right before me. We actually, coincidentally, both came through Ryan Contreras' graduate program. So the breeder before me was with Ryan Contreras and came to the Arboretum, and then he left and I took his job after I left Ryan Contreras, who was also an alumni of NC State for everyone who does not know him. So Joe had started this breeding project with some corylus or hazelnuts, and what he's looking to do is develop a seed cultivar of corylus that are all red foliage. So, like Red Dragon, and but they're not comported. And he also wanted them to be like a shrub form, not a tree form. So you could basically plant these all like on a tollway and like mow them over to maintain them, and they would just all sucker up, which is a fantastic idea. So I have these all planted in my tree breeding nursery right now in this like breeding population, so they can just cross-pollinate with each other. And then I would collect seed, sow those out. These are an F1 generation, these red colored ones. So that's a dominant trait, the red leaf in corylus. And so if I take it to another generation, I should start seeing green segregate from red. And then I can select all the red ones and keep, breeding them until I just have red. Unfortunately, like I mentioned with the elms and like the flower hardiness, corylus is one of those really early flowers in the season. And as soon as that temperature gets just high enough for them to start, setting those catkins out, they will, and then they'll get frozen. At least this group of them. That's what I've noticed. So I don't think I can, I'm going to have to, be creative, propagate them, bring them indoors to the glass house, which is what I do with the rest of my corylus. There are a few in there, though, that I think I can select right now.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm really excited about selecting one of those F1s, but then also using them to breed with. So we have a species called Corylus fergusii. So this is a corylus or hazelnut species that has this beautiful exfoliating bark, paper bark, like a river birch. And I want to develop that trait with the red foliage trait. And so I'm already almost there.
Really?
Yeah. So yeah, I think I'm probably just like 1 or 2 crosses away from that.
That would be awesome. That's such a great Fergusii. It's amazing.
Great.
Yeah.
And then I think there's variation in EFB tolerance. I think there's maybe like genetic variation, and then also, because there's a variation in strains of EFB2 or races. So I'd have to inoculate those, but I think that would be a really cool development. Another thing that I'm really excited about is, I have to have a magnolia project, because our curator of the collections is a huge magnolia fanatic. So it's kind of a given. So he's got a few ideas of his own, which, he's kind of been working on on the side. But one that I'm working on is I want to develop a Magnolia Sieboldii shrub that actually has improved flowers, so upright facing flowers. So the Sieboldii, Magnolia Sieboldii actually has the nodding flowers. You can't see the flowers very well. And then they have that really cool effect of those like red stamens in the center. So I'd like to get those flowers up.
I can tell you where there's a tree that has, or did, I haven't visited in a long time, but it's in Japan.
Oh, go get it for me.
Wait, we'll go. We'll go to Japan.
I'll go to Japan.
Yeah, we should go.
Definitely.
I know exactly where it is, right near a really good noodle place too.
I like noodles. Perfect. Noodles and magnolias. I mean, that's like a good title for a blog or more. So yeah, and that fragrance from Magnolia ovovata, that's amazing. So we have that also in the collections. And so I've been trying to do those, what's that, Wiesneri cross, and do that cross with the stuff that we have at the Arboretum. And we just started looking at Didsia like this week, so.
Yeah,
that's just a handful of projects that we're working on.
Yep, that's what you get when you work with Tom.
That's what it is. Yeah. So
we are hiring a plant breeder that was a Ryan Contreras trainee coming in.
Wait, what?
We've just hired. Well, I don't know if it's official yet, so I won't say a name, but Ryan Contreras, graduate, is working out his package for to come work with the department and J.C. Ralston Arboretum. So we're gonna have a plant breeder.
That is very exciting. He's going to be really excited. I'm not going to say anything, but.
Well, the candidate knows, and
he knows. Okay.
Yeah. He's in. I don't think he's officially signed a letter, so I don't want to say his name yet. But.
All right. Well, I won't say anything until I'm told officially. But that's really exciting to hear. I was wondering when that would happen. If it's the person I think it is, he's going to be incredibly great. He's full of wonderful energy. So.
Yeah. We're excited.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Kim and I are chatting because
looks like the chat is empty of questions.
I hope I didn't put everybody to sleep.
Oh, definitely not. It was fantastic.
That was great.
So glad to learn that there's some fall color breeding in elms. Those were stunning.
I am really excited about those. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you that. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask about this. So some elms that I've noticed and some elm relatives like Zelkova will have really nice fall color for us 1 out of every 5 years.
Right.
I mean, is that, how long do you think you're going to have to watch your elms to see that is going to be a consistent trait?
I think I'll have to watch those for a few years, but I mean, which is fine because, on the front end, that's the easiest trait to watch, so like I started watching them as seedlings and then I can keep watching them in the field. So I think that'll be an easier thing to select for.
True. Sure.
Because we do have those like off years here. I mean, since I've only lived here almost 4 years now. And the first year I was here was the best fall color year. So what I'm thinking is if like in a bad fall color year here, if I still have good fall color, then that'll be like a good selection for
right.
Fall. That's what I'm doing. So you should come in the fall. IPPS Eastern Region is meeting here in 2021. It's not the Southern Region, but you can always come to Eastern Region. And No.
Well, Southern region always meets when I'm usually out of the country collecting.
Oh, that's right. Because you're collecting seed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in September, so you'll probably
Oh,
out of the country.
that's early enough for me. I can do that.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's like the end of September. So it'll be at Morton, and then we're also having the ASHS meeting is in Chicago in a couple years also, 2022, so our centennial. And so we'll be doing Arboretum tours, I'm sure, for that.
Excellent. We'll bring a group up.
Yes, so please come visit us, especially any of you friends of the Arboretum.
Yeah.
Come see us at the Arboretum in Chicago.
Oh, this was fantastic. I love that Morton's doing this. They call themselves the champion for trees.
Yeah, the
Something,
champion of trees.
champion of trees, and they really take that to heart. They really focus on that. Are really doing conservation efforts around the world, breeding efforts. Really have become real leaders in this work on conserving trees and working with trees. And like Kim said, 25 years to develop trees, and when you're talking about shade trees, there is no commercial nursery that can make that kind of investment in the long-term shade tree breeding. They'll maybe if they find something by chance, but just concerted effort. Nobody else is doing that. And it takes a botanic garden, takes a place like Morton or the National Arboretum to even consider doing something like that. So it's incredibly, incredibly important work. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me as your guest.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. I feel like I've come full circle now. So.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So
yeah.
We'll get you in person.
Yay! And next time I'll bring maybe some elm seedlings with me.
There you go.
When I'm there in person.
Excellent.
Right.
I like it.
Well, thank you guys for all your attention.
Thank
Bye.
you. And we'll see you.